That thunder is just sound bouncing off the hills, and the dark between the trees is empty, and a careful woman keeps her door shut and her lamp low and lets the night have whatever the night wants. I used to believe that, back when I still thought the worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened, that grief was a door you walked through once and then it was behind you. Then one night the storm brought something to my woodshed that wasn't weather at all. It was small. It was shivering. And when it lifted its head and looked at me, it had eyes that did not belong to any animal I had ever fed in my life. 3 days later, the man who came looking for it would kneel in my doorway with rain running off him like a river, and he would call me by a name I had never once told him. If you've ever loved something knowing the whole time that you'd have to give it back, stay with me. This is the part nobody warns you about. This is where it starts. The thunder came in slow that night, the way it does over hollow pine, rolling down off the ridge like something dragging its feet. I was counting the gaps. I always count. 1 and 2 and 3, that's a habit my brother left me, the way some people leave you a watch or a coat. Eli used to lie on the floor of our father's house with his head in my lap and make me count the seconds between the flash and the boom so he'd know how far away the lightning was. 5 seconds is a mile, Marin, he'd say, very serious, 8 years old and certain of everything. Count it or it'll sneak up. So I count. 2 winters now without him, and I still count, alone, in a cabin at the edge of a forest the valley people won't walk into after the sun goes down. The lightning flashed. I counted. 3 seconds. Close. Close enough that the cups rattled on their hooks and the chickens went quiet in their box, the way they do when something bigger than them is awake outside. I had the kettle on. I remember that. I remember the small, ordinary heat of it against my palms, and the smell of wood smoke gone slightly sour because the wind kept pushing it back down the chimney. I remember thinking, the way you think 100 unremarkable things in a night, that I'd need to bring in another armful of split pine before the rain made the woodpile useless. That's when I heard it, under the thunder, a thin, broken sound that wasn't the wind. I want to be honest with you, because the people who tell these stories always make themselves brave, and I wasn't. My first thought wasn't something needs help. My first thought was don't. Don't open the door. Don't go out into that. There's a reason the old women in the valley press salt into the doorframe and won't say the word wolf after dark. There's a reason nobody builds out here but the desperate and the grieving, and I had been both. But the sound came again, and it cracked in the middle, and I knew that sound. I'd made that sound myself into a pillow, more nights than I'll admit. It was the sound of something small that had given up on being heard and was crying anyway, just because the crying had to go somewhere. I took the lantern. I took the iron poker because I'm not a fool, and I went out into the storm. The rain hit me like a hand. By the time I crossed to the woodshed, my hair was flat to my skull, and my nightdress was glued to my legs, and the lantern was swinging wild, throwing the world into jerks and shudders, wall, mud, the black wet line of the trees, gone, back again. I almost didn't see it. It had wedged itself into the gap between the woodpile and the shed wall, down low where the rain couldn't reach so hard, and it had made itself as small as a living thing can make itself. A wolf pup. That was what my eyes told me first. Gray going to silver at the throat, paws too big for its legs, ribs showing through soaked fur like the slats of a fence. It was hurt. There was a dark wrong patch on its flank, and it was holding one back leg up off the ground. I have buried things smaller than that. I've buried a great deal. I knelt down in the mud anyway because that's apparently the kind of fool I am, and I held out the back of my hand the way you do with a frightened animal, slow, palm down. I'm not going to hurt you, and the pup looked up at me. And the counting stopped, everything stopped. Because its eyes were the wrong color, not the flat gold green of a wild thing caught in lantern light. They were a deep, clear amber, ringed darker at the edge, and there was something in them, something that looked back at me and understood that it was being looked at. There was a person in there. I don't know how else to say it. You spend your life learning the difference between a creature's eyes and a child's, and I was looking at a child's eyes in an animal's face. And every old story the valley women ever frightened us with as girls came rushing up the back of my throat at once. I should have run. I want that on the record too. I thought about it. I crouched there in the rain with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I thought, Marin, you put that lantern down and you walk backward to your door and you bolt it, and you never tell a living soul what you saw out here. Then a fresh roll of thunder came down off the ridge, and the pup flinched so hard it cried out, and it tried to drag itself deeper into the gap on that broken leg, and it couldn't, and it looked at me again, and I swear to you it wasn't asking me to save it. It had stopped asking for anything. It just didn't want to be alone when it happened. I know that look. I have worn that look. All right, I said. My voice came out cracked and small. All right, come here, come on then, I've got you. I peeled it out of that gap as gently as I knew how, and it was so light it frightened me, all wet fur and shaking bone, and it didn't bite me though it could have, though every instinct in a hurt animal should have. It just turned its head and pressed its face into the crook of my arm and shook, and I carried it inside out of the storm and kicked the door shut behind us. And that small stupid choice, made in the rain with a poker forgotten in the mud, is where my old life ended, and I didn't even hear it close. I made a bed of it by the fire from an old grain sack in my second blanket, the good wool one, which tells you something about the state of my judgment. I cleaned the wound on its flank with water boiled and cooled and a strip torn off a clean shift, and it let me. The leg I splinted clumsy and careful with 2 flat sticks and the same torn cloth, the way my father taught me to splint a lamb's, and it whined once high, and then went quiet and let me do it. An ordinary wild animal does not let you do these things. It bites, it screams, it dies of its own terror before it dies of its wound. This one watched my hands the whole time with those amber eyes, learning me. I gave it broth in a saucer, the chicken broth I'd been keeping for myself because meat is dear out here and I am careful. It drank like it hadn't drunk in days, lapping until the saucer skated across the floor, and I filled it again, and again, and the third time I let my fingers rest in the fur behind its ears while it ate, and felt it lean, very slightly, into the warmth of my hand. You're somebody's, I told it. The thought made my chest hurt in a way I didn't examine. Somebody's out there missing you something terrible. I sat up most of that night. I told myself it was to keep the fire going, but the truth is I couldn't take my eyes off it. I kept thinking about the eyes. I kept thinking about the salt my grandmother pressed into the doorframe of her house every dusk of her life, and the way she'd say they're not animals and they're not men, and they keep to the deep wood, and we keep to the valley, and that's the arrangement. Child, you don't go breaking an arrangement that old. I'd thought she was a frightened old woman afraid of the dark. I'd thought a lot of things before. I must have slept finally, slumped in the chair with my chin on my chest, because the fire was low and gray when I woke, and the storm had blown itself out into a thin gray morning, and the bed by the hearth was empty. And there was a boy sitting on my floor. I didn't scream. I want to be proud of that, and I can't, because the truth is I was too far past frightened to make a sound. I just sat in my chair and stared, and the boy sat on my floor in the gray light and stared back, and between us the empty grain sack lay flat where an animal had been a few hours before. He was small, 5, maybe 6, it's hard to say with a child that thin. Dark hair stuck up every direction. He had my brother's blanket pulled up around his shoulders and clutched in 2 fists under his chin, and one of his legs was stuck out stiff and splinted exactly where the pup's broken leg had been. My 2 flat sticks, my torn cloth, my clumsy knots. And his eyes were amber, ringed darker at the edge, and they were the same eyes. They were exactly the same eyes. I am not going to pretend I understood it. I didn't. I don't fully understand it now. But there are moments when the world simply hands you a thing too large to argue with, and you can either spend that moment denying it, or you can deal with the child shivering on your floor. I have always been better at the second kind of thing. You're cold, I said. He didn't answer. He watched me get up, I went slow, slow as I had in the rain, palm down. "I'm not going to hurt you," and he flinched when the chair scraped. And when I crouched a careful distance away, he shrank back into the blanket until just his eyes showed. So I sat down on the floor. I don't know why I knew to do that, except that I'd grown up the eldest of a poor and frightened family, and I'd spent my girlhood getting smaller so my brother wouldn't be afraid. You learn that a tall person standing over a small one is a wall and a threat. You learn that if you want a scared thing to trust you, you put yourself on its level and you wait and you let it decide. So I lowered myself to the cold boards with my back against the chair, and I made no move toward him at all, and I started, quietly, to talk. I don't even remember what about. The chickens, the storm, how the kettle was probably ruined, the watch in my pocket and how my brother had liked the lightning. Nonsense, soft nonsense, the kind you pour over a frightened thing not for the words but for the warmth of a voice that isn't angry. And after a long while, a long, long while, the gray light strengthening at the window, the boy crept out from the blanket an inch at a time, and dragged that splinted leg across the floor, and stopped just out of my reach, and looked at me with those impossible eyes. "You hurt your leg," I said. "I fixed it as best I could. I'm not very good at it." He looked down at the splint as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked back up at me, and his small face did something complicated, and in a voice rusty from disuse, no louder than the fire, he said one word. "Broth." I laughed. I couldn't help it, it came out of me cracked and wet and far too big for the word that caused it, and the boy startled and then, watching my face, decided it was safe, and the corner of his mouth moved just barely, a thing that wanted to be a smile and had forgotten how. I made him broth. I made him broth until the pot was empty, and he ate sitting on my floor wrapped in a dead boy's blanket, and I sat across from him and learned his name was Finn, and that he didn't know how he'd gotten so far from home, only that there had been the storm and he'd been running and he'd been so tired, and he wasn't supposed to change when there were people. That was the rule, the biggest rule, but he'd been hurt and cold and the change had just happened, and now he was scared. Was I going to be angry? Was I going to tell? "Tell who?" I asked. And Finn pulled the blanket tight and his amber eyes went enormous and he said, "Anyone. You can't tell anyone you saw." He stayed. What else was I going to do? Turn a hurt child out into a forest the valley wouldn't enter? I told myself it was for a day, until the leg was better, until he could find his way back to wherever home was, which he wouldn't describe, except that it was past the ridge and through the deep wood, and his eyes went frightened and proud both when he spoke of it, the way a child speaks of a father he's a little afraid of and worships anyway. One day became two, two became three, and I will tell you that those 3 days cracked something open in me that I had nailed shut very deliberately 2 winters before. Because the cabin had a sound in it again, a small voice asking small questions. "Why do the chickens do that? What's that? Can I? Why not? What's this?" He found the watch. Of course he found it. Children find the one thing in a house you can't bear to have touched. I came in from the woodpile and he had it open in both hands, listening to it tick with his head tipped, that perfect animal stillness he had, and my whole body went cold and then, watching him, went warm in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He looked up, caught, ready to be in trouble. "It was my brother's," I said. "Where's your brother?" And I, who had not said the true thing out loud to a single living soul in 2 years, who had let the valley believe whatever the valley liked, looked at this strange child holding my brother's watch and said, "He drowned. In the spring melt. He was younger than me and I was supposed to be watching and I wasn't, and the water took him, and they didn't find him for 9 days. Finn considered this with the grave attention children give to true things. Then he climbed up into my lap, just climbed up, like it was nothing, like I was a thing that could be climbed, and he put the watch against my ear so I could hear it tick, and he said, "Now you can hear it whenever you want." I held very still, so he wouldn't see what my face was doing. That was the moment, if you want to know. Not the rescue, not the storm. That a half-wild child in my lap pressing a dead boy's heartbeat to my ear, that was the moment I stopped thinking of him as somebody else's and started, God help me, to think of him as mine, which is the most dangerous thing a person in my position can do. I knew it even then. I felt the danger of it like cold water around my ankles. And I let it rise anyway, because I had been so cold for so long, and he was so warm. He bolted once. The second evening, I'd said something. I don't even know what, something about when you go home, casual, and his face shut like a door, and before I could reach him he was up and across the floor, and through the gap in the door I'd left open for the air, out into the dusk on that splinted leg, faster than a hurt child should move. I went after him without my coat, without the lantern, calling his name into a forest that didn't want me. The light was going purple and the trees came down to the edge of my clearing like a held breath, and I found him at the tree line, frozen, staring into the dark, and the dark was staring back. Eyes, low to the ground, paired, gold and amber, and one pair higher than the rest, and more of them than I could count, a whole arc of them inside the trees, silent, watching the boy at the edge of the human world. I felt the hair rise on my arms. I felt, for the first time in my life, the full weight of my grandmother's salt and her arrangement and her warning, and understood that she had not been a frightened old woman at all. She had been a woman who knew exactly what lived past the trees. I did the most foolish thing I have ever done. I walked between Finn and the eyes, and I put my body in front of his, and I said, into the dark, in a voice I could barely keep level, "He's hurt. He's safe with me. He'll come home when he's mended." The eyes didn't move. The forest held its breath. And then, one by one, they withdrew, sinking back into the dark like stones into water, until there was nothing but trees and the wind and a child's hand finding mine, and gripping it so hard it ached. "They're watching for me," Finn whispered. "He sent them. He always knows where I am. He's coming, Marin. He's going to come and get me." "Who is?" I said. "Finn, who's coming?" And the boy looked up at me with those amber eyes full of love and terror and a child's helpless pride, and he said, "The king, my father, he's the king." The third night the storm came back. It came back worse, the ridge throwing thunder down like it had a grudge, the rain turning the clearing to a black mirror, the trees thrashing. Finn wouldn't sleep. He sat by the window with the watch in his fist, pressed to the cold glass, looking out into the lightning, and every time the white flash came he went rigid, and I knew he was counting too in his own way, counting down something I couldn't see. I had stopped pretending he would leave by morning. I had started in the secret cowardly part of myself to plan. We could go west, away from the ridge. Nobody in the valley knew he was here. Nobody had to. I could keep him. I had a whole speech ready, a whole life, and I knew every word of it was a lie even as I built it, and I built it anyway because that's what you do when you've found the warm thing and the cold is coming to take it back. Then the dogs in the far valley started up. All of them at once, the whole length of Hollow Pine, every dog for miles baying into the storm, and then, all at once, dead silence. Even the thunder seemed to pull back. And Finn slid off the chair and crossed to the door and put his small hand flat against the wood, and outside, in the clearing, in the lightning, something stood up out of the dark that had not been there a heartbeat before. A man tall, rain-soaked, black hair flat to his skull, standing in the open exactly where I'd carried a dying pup 3 nights before. Wolves flanked him in an arc, low and silent, their eyes a constellation in the dark. But I barely saw them. I saw him. I saw the way he stood absolutely still in the downpour with his eyes fixed on my door as though he could see straight through it, straight through me, to the child with his hand against the wood. The lightning flashed. I counted the way I always count, the way I cannot stop. 1. The boy whispered, "Papa." 2. And I put my hand on the latch, and I did not yet know whether I was about to open my door to save him, or to lose him, or both. And I understood, with the storm screaming and a king kneeling slowly into the mud of my clearing with his palms turned up like a man surrendering, that there was no version of the next minute where I got to keep what I had found. The wind came in sideways the second the latch gave, and the lamp behind me guttered and nearly died. And there, in the gray and silver chaos of the storm, was the man on his knees in my mud. He did not rush me. That was the first thing, and it undid half my fear in a single breath. A man who wanted to take a child by force does not kneel. He stayed down low in the rain, his palms turned up and open on his thighs, and he looked up at me through water streaming off his hair, and he did not so much as glance at the door he could have torn from its frame. I have tried many times to describe him, and I always fail, so I'll only tell you what I saw. He was big the way the old oaks on the ridge are big, not a thing that moves, a thing the weather moves around. Dark hair, dark brows, a face cut hard and weathered with a grief worn so deep into it that I recognized it instantly, the way you recognize your own reflection in a strange window. I knew that face. I'd been wearing a version of it for 2 years. It was the face of someone who had lost something and gone half mad with the searching. And his eyes were amber, ringed darker at the edge. Behind him the wolves held their arc, low and silent, rain sheeting off their backs, every one of them watching me with that terrible patient intelligence. But he had raised one hand a few inches off his thigh, a small flat gesture, and not one of them moved. Whatever he was, they answered to him absolutely, and he was kneeling in my mud asking permission to enter a peasant woman's cabin. The arrangement my grandmother spoke of, the deep wood for them, the valley for us. I was watching it bend, that night in the rain, and I didn't yet know which way it would break. "Papa," Finn's voice behind me, wet and small and breaking. He'd been holding it in. The instant the door opened he couldn't any more. "Papa, Papa." And he was past me, splinted leg and all, out into the storm, and the king came up off his knees and caught the child against his chest and folded around him so completely that for a moment Finn vanished entirely. Just 2 arms and a bowed dark head and the rain coming down on both of them. I heard the sound the man made. "I'll carry it to my grave." It wasn't a word. It was the noise a person makes when a thing they had given up for dead is suddenly, impossibly, warm and breathing in their arms. A great cracked exhale of everything he'd been holding since the storm took his boy. I'd made that noise too once, except mine had been over a body they'd finally found, and his was over a child still living, and I stood in my doorway in the cold spray and felt something twist in me that was glad for him and grieving for me and could not tell the two apart. He held his son and shook. The king of whatever lived past the ridge knelt in a stranger's mud and shook like a leaf, and I looked away, because some things you don't watch. When he finally raised his head, Finn still wound around his neck. He looked at me, really looked, the way Finn had looked at me that first gray morning, learning my face. And he said, in a voice rough as bark and quiet as the space after thunder, you're the one who pulled him out of the storm." "He was hurt," I said. My own voice came out strange. "He crawled into my woodshed. I didn't know what he was, not at first." "And when you knew?" I thought about lying. I thought about the salt and the arrangement and every reason a wise woman keeps her mouth shut and her door closed. Then I thought about a child climbing into my lap to press a dead boy's heartbeat to my ear, and I told him the truth. When I knew, I made him more broth. Something moved across the king's hard face, there and gone, like the flash before the count. He set the boy down gently, keeping one big hand spread across Finn's narrow back, and he rose to his full height, and even soaked and exhausted, he was a great deal of man to have standing in your clearing. And then he did a thing I will never forget. He inclined his head to me. A bow, small but real, from a creature his wolves would have died for, to a barefoot woman in a wet nightdress holding a poker she'd forgotten she was holding. "Then I owe you a debt," he said, "that I do not know how to pay, Marin." The poker hit the floor. I want you to understand. I had never told him my name. I told it to a frightened child 3 days before, but Finn had had no way to send it past the ridge, no way to send anything. The boy had been with me every hour, sleeping by my fire, eating my broth here. And yet this man had crossed my clearing in a storm and bowed his head and said Marin as if he had known it for years. How, I said, it was all I could get out. How do you, I never. I know who you are. He said it carefully, watching me the way you watch someone you're afraid you've hurt. I have known for 2 years, Marin Holt, of the cabin at the wood's edge that the others won't come near. He paused, and the rain filled the pause, and then he said the thing that took the floor out from under me. We were there. The spring the river took your brother. My people heard him go in. We hear everything that happens at the edge of the wood. One of mine went into the water after him. Tried to bring him to the bank. A muscle moved in his jaw. The melt was too strong. She nearly drowned herself. She could not reach him in time. I could not breathe. 9 days. 9 days they'd searched and dragged the river, and I had stood on the bank gone hollow with it. Certain I was the only one who'd tried. Certain no one had been there in those first cold minutes when it might have mattered. And all this time there had been a creature out of my grandmother's stories who had gone into the killing water for a poor woman's brother and failed, and had carried that failure too. After the king went on lower, she kept watch on the woman at the wood's edge who'd lost him. It became a thing my people did, a quiet thing, not because we owed you, because. He stopped. He looked suddenly like a man who'd said more than he meant to. Because grief is grief on either side of the trees. We watched over you, Marin, badly, from a distance. The way you watch something you cannot help. I thought of 2 years of nights. Of the times I'd felt watched and told myself it was the wind. Of the deer that never touched my garden and the fox that never took my hens though foxes had taken everyone else's. Of how, all that frozen lonely time, I had not, in fact, been as alone as I'd believed. And then, he said, and now his hand tightened on his son's shoulder, my boy ran, out of the wood, toward the one place at the edge of it where someone might be kind. He looked down at Finn, and the grief in his face sharpened into something else, fear, raw and recent. He didn't crawl into your shed by accident, Marin. He came looking for you. Some part of him knew there was a person here who pulls drowning things out of the dark and asks no payment for it. Ran from what? I said, because that was the word that had snagged, not lost, ran. And the king of the deep wood looked out at the storm, at the thrashing trees, at the dark past the dark. And for the first time since he'd knelt in my mud, he looked afraid. We went inside. There are limits to how long even a king will let his recovered child stand shivering in the rain, and there are limits to how long a woman will leave her door open in a storm, even for this. He had to fold himself near double to come through, and once inside he made my whole cabin look like a doll's house, like something he might break by breathing wrong. And he was so careful, so deliberately, painfully careful not to break anything, that I understood he was used to being feared, and was trying, in my small home, not to be. Finn fell asleep almost at once. That's the thing about children, they carry terror like a stone all day, and then the danger passes and the stone drops and they're simply, instantly asleep. He went down on the grain sack bed by the fire, my brother's blanket pulled to his chin, the watch still in his fist, and his father knelt beside him and watched him breathe for a long while like a man relearning a thing he'd nearly lost the right to. I made tea. I didn't know what else to do with my hands. The king Caspian, he told me his name was Caspian, and it felt strange and enormous in my mouth. Took the cup in both hands like it was something rare, and we sat on either side of the fire with the sleeping boy between us, and in a low voice, so as not to wake him, he told me why his son had run. There was sickness in the deep wood, not a sickness of the body, a sickness of the old order, a faction among his own kind who had decided the arrangement my grandmother spoke of was a leash, who looked at the valley and the river and the soft, warm villages, and saw not a boundary to keep but a thing to take. They'd moved against Caspian first, as such things always do, because a king who keeps the peace is the first wall a war has to knock down. 3 nights ago they'd come for the air for Finn in the dark, while the storm covered them, meaning to take the boy and break the father with him. And a nurse had died getting Finn out a window, and the child had run on instinct into the only dark he half knew, toward the wood's edge, toward the cabin, toward me. They will come again, Caspian said very quietly into his tea. They know now that he lived. They will follow the same trail I followed, which means, and he looked up at me and there was no softness left in it, only a terrible flat honesty. I have led death to your door, Marin, by coming for him. I am sorry. I did not see another way to find my son, and now I cannot leave you here. Not after tonight. Not at the edge of the wood with my enemy's eyes already on this clearing. The fire popped. Finn sighed in his sleep and rolled toward the warmth. You're saying I have to leave my home, I said. I'm saying I will not be the cause of one more death at this wood's edge. His voice cracked just slightly on it, the controlled, careful voice of a man who has buried a nurse and nearly buried a son in 3 days. You can come into the wood under my protection, where the boy you saved can sleep behind walls 100 of them couldn't break. Or you can go west, away from all of it, with gold enough to buy a holding 3 valleys over and never think of any of us again, and I will set my people to guard the road until you're clear of it. He set down the tea. Either way, you will not stay here and die for my mistake. I won't allow it. It is the one thing I can give you that's worth giving. And there it was, the choice, laid in front of me at my own fire by a king, with my brother's blanket rising and falling on a sleeping child's chest between us. I have made hard choices in my life. Most of them I made too late, or wrong, or alone. This one I want to tell you about plainly, because it's the heart of the whole thing, and because I think you'll understand it better than I did that night. The West was the safe choice. Gold, a new valley, a clean break. I'd never see Finn again. I'd never see this strange, grieving king again. I'd take their secret west with me and grow old 3 valleys over, and the warm thing the storm had given me would become, in time, a story I half believed I'd dreamed. Safe. Sane. The choice my grandmother would have wept with relief to see me make. The wood was the mad choice. To walk into the deep dark my whole people feared, behind a man who just told me his enemies wanted him dead, to live among creatures out of a child's nightmare, for the sake of a boy who wasn't mine and never could be. I looked at Caspian. He was watching the fire, giving me the courtesy of not watching me decide, and I could see what it had cost him to offer the West at all, to hand me the door out, when every line of him, the way he'd held the boy, the way he kept glancing at me and away, said he did not, in some deep wordless place, want me to take it. He'd offered it anyway. He'd offered me the safe road knowing he wanted me on the dangerous one. That, more than the bow, more than the kneeling, more than the name, that was the thing that decided me. A man who'll hand you the door out when he's aching for you to stay is a man you can trust at your back in a dark wood. But it wasn't him that made the choice, not really, and I won't pretend it was. I want to be honest with you to the end. I looked at the boy. Finn had thrown one arm out of the blanket in his sleep, the splinted leg I'd set with my clumsy hands, the watch loose in his fingers. My brother's watch, ticking against a sleeping child's palm. Now you can hear it whenever you want. And I thought about 2 years of a cabin with no voice in it but my own. I thought about how the storm had brought me a drowning thing and I had pulled it out, the way someone unseen had once gone into the river for my own drowning brother and failed. I thought the wood went into the water for Eli and could not save him. Maybe I was being given the chance to go into the dark for one of theirs and not fail. You can call it many things, grief maybe, or stubbornness. I have always been told I am stubborn past sense. Or just a tired, lonely woman finally, recklessly, choosing the warm thing over the safe one. I'll come into the wood, I said, with you, with him. Caspian's head came up. For one unguarded second the careful king was gone entirely, and there was just a man looking at me across a fire as if I'd handed him something he hadn't dared ask for. Marin, he said, you don't know what you're. No, I agreed, I don't. I've never known what I was walking into a single day of my life, and I've walked into all of it anyway. I picked up the poker from where I dropped it, set it back by the hearth, and looked at him steady. I pulled your son out of a storm not knowing what he was. I think I can manage the rest of it the same way. I let out a breath. Besides, Somebody has to keep that leg splinted right. You'd make a mess of it. And the king of the deep wood, the great oak that the weather moves around, laughed once, short, astonished, like a sound rusted from disuse, and pressed the back of his hand briefly to his mouth, and looked at me over it with those amber eyes. And for one moment in a storm with a war coming, we were just two grieving people who'd been alone too long, sitting at a fire, finding out we weren't alone anymore. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I some things you don't name out loud the first night, not when there's a child sleeping between you and an enemy in the trees. But I felt it settle into the room the way warmth settles, the way the storm had finally settled outside into a soft, steady rain. And I knew, the way you know the lightning's close before you finish the count, that whatever this was, it had already begun, and there was no door back out of it that I would ever want to take. We left before dawn. The rain had gentled to a mist by then, and the clearing was silver with it, and the wolves had drawn in close around the cabin in a loose ring, no longer watching me like prey but like a thing they'd been told to guard. Caspian carried Finn, still sleeping, against his shoulder. I carried what a person carries when she leaves the only home grief ever let her build, which is to say, almost nothing. A change of clothes, a knife, the empty broth pot because Finn had asked for it, half asleep, and I'm weak. And my brother's watch, which Finn had pressed back into my hand at the door without my asking, closing my fingers over it with his small, certain ones, the way he'd done everything since the first morning, like it was nothing, like I was a thing that could be loved. At the tree line I stopped. I looked back at the cabin one time. 2 years of my life were in it, and a great deal of my grief, and I half expected leaving it to feel like losing something. It didn't. It felt like setting something down that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. Caspian waited. He didn't rush me. He'd shifted the sleeping boy to his other shoulder, and he stood at the edge of the dark wood, half in my world and half in his, and he watched me say goodbye to the place where I'd been alone. And when I was ready, he held out his free hand to me across the line of the trees, across the arrangement, across the boundary, across everything my grandmother had pressed salt against every dusk of her frightened life. I took it. The wood closed around us. It was darker in there than any dark I'd known, and older, and full of sounds I had no names for yet. Somewhere ahead lay walls and a king's enemies and a war I'd chosen with my eyes half open. Somewhere behind, the storm I'd come through was already breaking up over the ridge, leaving the kind of clean, washed quiet that makes you believe, for a foolish minute, that the worst has passed. It hadn't. I knew it hadn't. I'd felt the fear in him when he spoke of what was coming, and you don't unfeel a thing like that. But Finn stirred against his father's shoulder, and his amber eyes opened, and found me there in the dark walking beside them where I had no business being. And he smiled, a real one now, no longer a thing that had forgotten how, and he reached out one small hand, and I took that too. And we went into the wood together, the three of us, into whatever was waiting. The watch ticked against my palm the whole way. I counted the gaps. I always count. I just didn't know yet, that morning, holding a king's hand and a boy's, how many of us would still be alive to hear it tick by spring.